My mom sided with my stepfather. And his kids threw me out. But they forgot that I'm the owner of the house. Now is the time to reclaim it. I never imagined that my dad's meticulous planning regarding family assets would cause everything to fall apart. There's a lot to understand. And I want to make sure I give you the full picture. So let me start from the beginning. I work at one of the big tech companies in Seattle as a senior software architect. My dad always thought I should do this kind of work. Technology is the future, he would exclaim proudly after I got accepted into the university's computer science program. He had a successful construction business. And although he wasn't technical, he had a special talent for predicting trends. This started after the recession in the 80s when he started his construction business from scratch in some of the most difficult times for the industry. We lived in a small apartment and were very frugal. But my dad had unwavering faith in his vision. He always said that the key was to build relationships. Not just buildings. That mentality helped him get through the difficult early years. My dad's business was unique because he treated his clients and employees with a lot of respect. Even if it meant losing bids to rivals who offered lower prices or impossible promises. He always stood firm in his belief that prices should be transparent. And deadlines must be met to build trust. My dad's business was famous for doing complex restorations that required a lot of technical expertise and historical sensitivity. In the 90s, he became famous in the Seattle area thanks to the loyalty he had created with his clients and his staff. His company survived the financial crisis of 2008 when many other construction businesses failed. During that time, he didn't lay off anyone. But instead, he reduced his own income to zero and took out a second mortgage on his home. I learned more about leadership watching him handle that situation than I would have learned in any management course. He told me that his employees were like his extended family. If you take care of them, they will take care of you, he would say. I didn't realize at the time how much his way of managing the business affected my own career. Many of his ideas I applied when I was promoted to team leader at my software company. I established detailed documentation procedures for our code just like my dad kept complete records of each construction project at each site. I led my development team through difficult project deadlines thanks to his focus on fostering good relationships. I met 34-year-old Emily at a hackathon in my third year. She helped me plan the event while studying business administration. Despite my lack of sleep, my addiction to energy drinks, and my disheveled appearance, she somehow found my love of code charming. From the first time he saw her, my dad fell in love with her. "You're a keeper," he said after their first meal together. "Don't let this one get away." After college, my dad even helped Emily launch her own marketing company. He introduced her to his network of local entrepreneurs, showed her how he drafted his contracts, and shared his business goals with her. He always said that success was not just what you knew but also about helping others succeed. My dad was always willing to share his experience and teach something unique. During those formative years, Emily and I always went to my parents' house on Sundays for dinner. We would all sit on the back deck that my dad had built, chatting about everything and nothing while he got the grill going. Although he didn't understand most of the technical details of my most recent work, he always asked. Mom would say, "There they go again with the computer talk," with a loving gesture of disapproval. My dad's pride and joy was the house itself. He bought it with the proceeds from his first big construction project in the 90s, which was a historical restoration. His business became famous in one of the oldest neighborhoods in Seattle. This beautiful craftsman-style house has a large porch and a garage that my dad transformed into the most organized workshop I've ever seen. Everything is labeled and placed with almost fanatical precision. Each tool has its place. And my dad managed everything. The house was like a living example of his skill. Each renovation was organized with great care and recorded. Each repair, improvement, and paint job was documented on a spreadsheet that he maintained. "A house is like a living thing," he would say as he taught me how to clean the gutters or inspect the foundations. He had a maintenance regimen that included everything from checking the roof after winter storms to changing the air filters. "If you don't take care of the small things, they become big problems," he used to say. In addition to being his refuge, the workshop served as a classroom where he taught me about things that weren't just tools. He added unique storage options and a workbench that he made especially to teach me carpentry. He had renovated the entire garage himself. He said that each piece of wood has its own story. While we worked on the pegboard wall where there were outlines for each tool. It wasn't just about organization but about his teaching method. I believe everything has a place and a purpose. Our job is to help tell that story, he would say. Our family greatly valued weekends in that garage. My dad and I would work for hours and hours on his 1967 Mustang. When I was 12, Dad bought it to restore, saying it would be a project that would strengthen our bond as father and son. That car became a classroom of life lessons. His advice, which I still follow now, was simple: always use the right tool for the job. Shortcuts may seem tempting, but they will cost you money in the long run. Although Dad could have finished the Mustang project in a year if he had wanted to, it took 3 years. He was more interested in the process than the final destination. I learned everything from project management to basic mechanics from him. We took photos of every component we changed, recorded each step, and kept a complete record of our progress. It wasn't just about fixing a car. He said it was about learning to divide big problems into manageable parts. I realized that this lesson was very useful in my work as a software developer. Emily and I bought a small house about a 20-minute drive from my parents' house after we got married. Although Dad insisted that we get the mortgage in our own name, he helped us with the down payment. You need to build your own credit history, he told us. He made it clear that it was about being independent. He taught me how to install ceiling fans and fix drywall while we worked on our renovations on the weekends. He was preparing me for the responsibilities of homeownership. At that time, my career was really taking off. I had just received a promotion to team leader, overseeing a group that was creating infrastructure solutions. I enjoyed every second, although the hours were long and the stress was high. During my lunch breaks, my dad used to call me to see how I was doing without discussing anything in particular. He knew how hard it was to manage a team and supervise the work of others. Remember to delegate, he would tell me. You can't do everything yourself. Just like I can't build a house alone. When my dad started saying that he always felt exhausted, we were discussing how to handle all those responsibilities and the possibility of starting a family. He kept postponing seeing a doctor despite Mom's insistence. He was working too hard and dismissed our worries. He was focused on his biggest project to date, a multi-million-dollar development deal that would have secured the future of his business. In hindsight, I regret not insisting more on those checkups. Maybe things could have been different. At that time, the business was expanding rapidly. Dad was discussing how to grow into historical restoration projects in the Pacific Northwest and had recently opened a second office in Portland. He had earned a great reputation for updating the infrastructure of historic buildings without sacrificing their character. He would tell his clients that it was about embracing the future while respecting the past. Everything he accomplished both in his personal and professional life was influenced by his love for the preservation of the Mustang. That was the topic of our last major discussion. He was talking about taking it to car shows now that we had finished the restoration. When he mentioned that we should register for the Pacific Northwest Classic, his eyes were shining like a child's. He continued planning the future until the end and said, "Let's show these young kids what a real sports car looks like." That's how it started. It was a morning like any other until everything changed. When Mom called, my phone vibrated while I was in an early meeting. We were in the middle of an important conversation about a project, so I almost didn't answer. But something compelled me to step out and take the call. For some reason, Mom was crying so hard that she had trouble speaking. Dad had collapsed at a construction site. When I arrived at the hospital, the physical therapist told me it had been a sudden and severe heart attack. He was only 58 years old. The weeks following Dad's death were a blur of grief and paperwork. The funeral was packed. My dad's business and his involvement in the community had touched many people. Suppliers, contractors, and even rival companies came to show their support. Everyone shared a story about how Dad had helped them, given them advice, or had just been there when they needed someone to trust. An old craftsman told me that despite not being able to work due to an illness, my dad had managed to keep him on the payroll. He told me that my dad understood that business was about people first. The company's workers were heartbroken, Many of them had known my dad for decades and told me things I had never heard before. Like how he had paid for a foreman's daughter's university textbooks, or how he had helped another with a divorce, or stayed late to teach apprentices the details of historical restoration. With handwritten messages and comments from both clients and employees. The conference room at the workplace became an unofficial memorial. We were all amazed at how well Dad had prepared for everything. A week after the funeral, his lawyer, Mr. Anderson, called us for a meeting. He pulled out a huge accordion file that said Family Safety Protocol and was carefully handwritten by Dad. Inside were dozens of papers organized with complete instructions. Several areas of his land were located. And Mr. Anderson gave me a 3-day tour of all of Dad's inheritance paperwork. Each color-coded container had personal notes describing his decisions. In addition to the legal paperwork. "I've never seen such a complete inheritance plan in my 35 years of practice," commented Mr. Anderson. Dad had even included a 5-year business transition plan with backup plans for various circumstances. After that, Mom started going to her church's grief support group. There she met Steve, a 58-year-old man. At first, she just mentioned him in passing. Steve suggested a book about healing or told her it was normal to feel that way. He was one of the facilitators of the group and had lost his wife to cancer 2 years earlier. Although it seemed a bit early, I was happy that Mom was getting support. Emily reminded me that everyone experiences grief in a unique way. Every Tuesday night, the church grief support group met. Soon Mom started attending church functions with Steve. Often after the services, the coffee meetings would turn into lunch meetings. And those in turn became dinner dates. Our family friends began to worry about how quickly their friendship was developing. In a family meeting, my Aunt Jane pulled me aside because she was worried that Mom was rushing to compensate for Dad's absence. The changes in Mom became more evident. She cut her hair, started dressing differently, and even threw out the garden Dad had helped her make. I think that every time I questioned these changes, Mom would respond, "It's time for a new beginning." The woman who used to spend hours telling me about her life with him hardly ever mentioned him anymore. Everything happened faster than any of us had anticipated. Mom announced that Steve would move in 6 months after Dad's death. James, 30, and Lisa, 32, his own adult children, joined them. She thought it would be beneficial to give the house a new life. I made an effort to be understanding. But it seemed like Mom was in a hurry to replace everything that Dad had built. I'm at a crossroads right now. How can I preserve Dad's legacy without jeopardizing Mom's chances for happiness? Emily advises me to find a balance. But I can't help but think about Dad's letter, "Son, preserve those memories." It has been 3 months since my last publication. And things have gotten much worse. Steve's domineering behavior used to bother me. But now he acts like he owns the house that Dad left me. Steve made the decision to start a major restoration project last month without even asking my permission. The bookshelves that Dad had made for the living room were being torn apart by contractors. When I visited one weekend, as if he were the owner of the building, Steve was watching them and ordering them to throw all this old wood into the dumpster. These shelves were the last project that Dad and I worked on together. So for him, they were more than just simple shelves. He responded angrily when I approached him. "Look, son," he said with a condescending emphasis on the pronoun. "This house needs to be brought into the 21st century. Your father's taste was very outdated. We're doing you a favor by increasing the value of the property." I reminded him that any modifications required my legal consent. Mom obviously agreed with him. But he just laughed and added, "Your mother and I live here. We don't need permission to improve our house." "Steve knows about these things," she acknowledged. "He's just trying to help." The woman who used to love those shelves where she used to place her collection of antique teacups for Christmas now acts as if they were just taking up space. I showed her Dad's maintenance plans for the house. But she ignored them because they lived in the past. In addition, the relationship with Steve's children has deteriorated. James took over Dad's workshop and turned it into a CrossFit facility while I was on a business trip. He held a garage sale and sold most of Dad's tools, repainted rooms, and installed modern vinyl planks instead of the meticulously restored wood floors made by Dad. Lisa is treating the space as if it were her own personal design project. One night after dinner, Steve took me aside and told me that since we were paying to live here, we should have our names on the deed. It's only fair. I had to explain to him that we weren't. We weren't paying a mortgage because Dad's planning had already paid for the house in full. They don't even cover the rent. All the maintenance expenses, insurance, and property taxes, I pay for myself. Emily recommended that we stop making weekly visits now that Emma is here. Correct. No one benefits from the stress in that home. However, taking a back seat has only made Steve more confident. He started sending me bills for improvements that I never approved and started doing them more regularly. I should be more understanding of Mom's new life, according to Mom's friend who called me recently. I tried to explain Dad's intentions and my legal obligations, but she just accused me of being stuck in the past. Steve makes her happy. Why can't you let them make the house their own? She asked. I discovered this week that the growth markers that recorded my height from age 3 to 18 had been removed from the kitchen door frame. Every birthday, Dad would measure me and write the date next to each mark. It's just a door frame. We can't keep every piece of wood just because your father touched it. Mom commented when I confronted her about this. Now I spend more time sitting in Dad's old chair, the only piece of furniture I could keep, in my own garage. Mr. Anderson advises me to start considering long-term arrangements. Legally, the house belongs to me. But eventually, I will have to make some difficult decisions regarding its fate. When being the bad guy becomes more important than preserving your father's legacy. And when your entire family opposes you, how do you defend what's right? The situation has reached a breaking point. And I have finally made a decision that will likely change everything. I spoke with my financial advisor about the situation with the house last week. We could have a considerable rental income, enough to cover Emma's future fund, because the property values nearby have increased by 40% in the last 3 years. I discovered in the conversation that I had been so worried about the sentimental elements that I had not taken into account the financial ramifications of allowing Mom and Steve to live in it rent-free. Everything got out of control when I commented this to Mom in our weekly conversation. She screamed on the phone. "You can't do this to us. This is where we live." Steve worked very hard on this. She refused to listen when I tried to explain that I was only considering my options. She continued talking about all the improvements they had made, completely ignoring the fact that she had never given my approval for those changes. An hour later, Steve called. He was upset, and his tone was different from his usual arrogant attitude. "Listen well," he announced. "In this house, we have established a life. Because you miss your father, you can't just come in and ruin everything." He interrupted me when I tried to explain the financial problems, saying that they now had equity in the property. I reminded him that the house legally belonged to me. "There's a reason Dad left it to me," I said. "Your father is not here anymore," he replied. "You must consider life." I talked to Emily about it and also to Mr. Anderson the next day before making a decision. When I arrived at the house, Mom and Steve were working on another remodeling project in the dining room. They had begun to remove the original crown molding that Dad had milled specifically to match the old style of the house. Seeing this made me more determined. I told them they had 2 weeks to find another place to live. Mom immediately burst into tears and accused me of being insensitive and harsh. Steve tried to intimidate me, arguing with me about my inability to kick them out on the street. He began listing all his local connections, including his workplace, his church, and his neighborhood. When faced with the difficult circumstances, I maintained my composure and firmness as my father had taught me. I declared that this was my property, that Dad had left it to me for a reason, and that I was exercising my legal right as the owner. Steve's cheeks flushed, and he began to list all the money they had spent on improvements. I informed him that the historical value of the property had actually been reduced by these alterations. When Lisa returned home and joined the debate, things got worse. Mom immediately used her pregnancy as emotional leverage. "How are you capable of treating your stepsister this way? She's going to give birth to a child." Although Lisa's pregnancy was important to them, I had to tell them that it did not affect my property rights and that she is not my stepsister. There has been a continuous onslaught of emotional manipulation ever since Mom's whole family joined forces to oppose me. Her sister called sobbing, saying that her parents wanted to make sure that Mom was safe. Steve's brother left a message about the challenging rental market, a local real estate agent, and long messages about Christian ideals and family loyalty. Even distant cousins that I barely know joined them. Dealing with family friends who have known me since I was a child is the most difficult thing. People who grew up with me are now telling me how unhappy they are with my decisions. And every call seems like another small betrayal. Some even claim that I am damaging Dad's reputation in the neighborhood. The problem is that this has nothing to do with cruelty or profit. This is about honoring Dad's wishes and preserving the things that he created. It has been quite agonizing to watch them methodically destroy every trace of him. The house was his legacy. I paid all their expenses. I let them live independently for years. And I endured their unapproved changes. Eventually, they have 2 weeks to present new plans. I refuse to give in to Mom's constant demands for more time. Mr. Anderson claims that the law is completely on my side and that I have been more than lenient. He is helping me create the official documentation for the eviction notice, ensuring that everything is documented accurately. I realize that this makes me look like the villain in everyone else's story. But sometimes defending what is right requires making difficult decisions even when others disagree. I learned that from my dad. I appreciate everyone's help during this difficult time. Things have reached an inevitable end, therefore. This will probably be my last update. I assigned Mom and Steve a 2-week deadline. But the last 2 weeks have already passed. They have been the longest weeks of my life. Filled with guilt, constant emotional manipulation, and increasingly desperate attempts to change my mind. Mom did everything she could. She called me every day, oscillating between rage and tears, saying, "One day I changed your diapers. I left everything for you." The next day, she would scream. Steve also changed strategy, trying to negotiate instead of using intimidation. He recommended establishing a formal lease agreement and offered to start paying rent. However, I could not trust that they would comply with the agreements we had made given what they had done to Dad's house. When I arrived at the house, there were people gathered on the front lawn. 3 days before the deadline, Mom had asked family friends from the church and even some of Dad's old business partners for help. They had prepared statements about moral commitments and family responsibilities as part of what seemed like an intervention. I listened to people criticize me for being a bad son for 2 hours. The topic of honoring parents was discussed by Mom's pastor. Dad's old secretary recalled his generosity with tears in her eyes. My elementary school teacher even came to remind me of the morals that Dad tried to instill in me. The most difficult part was when Lisa stood up and spoke about how stress could harm her unborn child while she covered her abdomen with her hands. Mom was crying next to her. Some of the women from the church stared at me. It was an expert lesson in emotional manipulation. But during this ambush, something unexpected happened. I had a strange feeling of serenity while sitting there listening to everyone talk about Dad, people who weren't even at his funeral suddenly professing to know what he would have wanted. I thought, stand your ground and defend what you know is right. I could almost hear his voice in my mind. I stood up and spoke to the group. I described how Dad had planned everything carefully to ensure the future of his family and how he had built this house by hand. I showed them pictures of Steve's unapproved modifications, including the historical elements he ruined and the fine craftsmanship he replaced with flimsy modern fixtures. After that, I presented a letter from Dad explaining his reasons for leaving everything to me. Some of Dad's business partners nodded while reading his comments on trust, responsibility, and preservation. They understood his legacy because they knew Dad. They really knew him. Soon after, the group dispersed. Some looked with disapproval. The righteous anger had already calmed down. And others apologized gently as they walked away without saying another word. Mom and Steve went back inside. I arrived there with Mr. Anderson and a locksmith on the morning of the deadline. Although they were not needed, I had hired a security company in case the house was left vacant. The rest of their belongings were packed in Steve's truck. Steve couldn't help but give me one last jab. But Mom refused to look at me while he helped Lisa into his truck. He asked me, "Are you happy with yourself? Your father would be very proud of how you've treated your mother." I didn't answer. Dad would have known. I know it. He had prepared for this possibility. What other reason could he have had for being so explicit in his will? I walked through the house after they left. I had underestimated the extent of the damage. Low-quality materials had been used to replace the original fixtures that Dad had put in. They had painted over or removed Dad's handcrafted woodwork. We spent so many weekends in his workshop. And now it was completely changed. I don't intend to claim damages. But Mr. Anderson documented everything in case a legal issue arises. I just want to leave this chapter behind and focus on fixing what can be fixed. Some of Dad's old craftsman friends have already been contacted and are eager to help rebuild the features that were removed. For now, Mom is staying with her sister. Most of my relatives have stopped talking to me, although some occasionally call me out on social media. Steve's children continue to share posts about how bad my mother is doing. But fewer and fewer people are responding to those posts. Emily has been my great support. She reminds me of Dad's letter every time I start to doubt myself, expressing her confidence in my ability to make the right decisions. Finally, I will tell Emma about her grandfather and the legacy he tried to preserve. But for now, she is too young to understand what is happening. I am collaborating with a restoration professional to preserve the spirit of what Dad did. Although it won't be perfect, some things cannot be reversed. First, I will restore the workshop. That very place where I learned from my father is where I want my daughter to learn as well. Being the villain in someone else's story is sometimes the price of doing what is right. Maybe I can never rebuild the relationships I lost, but I can live with the fact that I preserved what my father entrusted to me. As Dad used to say, integrity is doing what is right even when it hurts, and not taking the easy way out. I think he would understand.